subscribe to the channel and become part of our Nordic love stories family, because some promises are too powerful to be forgotten. He had crossed an ocean for one reason alone: to keep a promise. As the last snow of winter melted across the silent Norwegian fjords, the cowboy walked the familiar trail once again. Every frozen step carried the memory of the girl he had loved, the girl he had found, and the girl he had lost. Most people believed time erased love, but he knew better. Love never disappeared. It only waited for the brave enough to return. The old wooden cabin finally appeared between the pine trees, exactly as he remembered it. The roof was still covered with patches of snow, the smoke no longer rose from the chimney, and the wooden porch remained empty. Months had passed since he had stood there with her, promising that no matter where life carried them, he would come back. He slowly touched the cabin door. Before closing his eyes, her laughter still echoed inside his heart. Memories rushed back like the cold wind sweeping across the valley. He remembered the first time they met beside the fjord, the shy smile that changed everything, the quiet evenings beside the fireplace, the promises whispered beneath the endless Nordic sky, the painful goodbye that neither of them truly accepted, and the second heartbreaking separation that left them both believing fate had won. But fate had underestimated the strength of a promise. He stepped inside the empty cabin. Dust floated through the sunlight, the wooden table remained untouched, and the blanket she had once wrapped around herself still rested on the old chair. Every corner reminded him of her gentle voice. He whispered her name into the silence, hoping the cabin itself might answer. Nothing came except the sound of the wind outside. Still, he refused to believe he was too late. He walked back outside and looked toward the frozen fjord, where they had once promised to find each other again, no matter how impossible life became. The water shimmered beneath the fading winter light, peaceful yet lonely. He smiled through the sadness because he knew one thing with absolute certainty. She had believed in his promise just as much as he had believed in hers. If she had waited even for one day, then she deserved a lifetime of waiting from him in return. Without another word, he pulled his coat tighter, looked toward the endless Norwegian wilderness, and began searching once more, determined that this journey would not end until their story finally found its way home. The search continued long after the morning light spread across the Norwegian valley. The cowboy followed every path they had once walked together, refusing to believe that hope could simply disappear. He returned to the edge of the quiet fjord where they had shared their first peaceful conversation, but only the gentle sound of water greeted him. The icy wind carried memories instead of answers. He called her name once more, his voice echoing across the cliffs before fading into silence. Every step reminded him that love was never easy, but the hardest journeys often led to the most beautiful endings. Leaving the shoreline behind, he entered the ancient pine forest. Sunlight slipped through the tall trees, painting golden patterns across the melting snow. The forest felt familiar, as though it remembered every secret they had shared beneath its branches. He searched carefully, hoping to find even the smallest sign that she had passed this way. Suddenly, something caught his eye beneath a patch of snow. Kneeling down, he gently picked it up. It was a delicate silver feather pendant hanging from a worn leather cord. His heart stopped for a moment. He recognized it instantly. It had belonged to her grandmother, the precious family keepsake she never removed from her neck. She once told him that as long as the feather stayed close to her heart, she would never lose her way. Holding the necklace tightly, he smiled through his tears. This was no accident. She had been here. Whether she had dropped it by mistake or left it as a sign, he could not know. But one thing became clear. He was following the right path. The promise they had made was still alive. The trail eventually led him toward a small village, resting between the mountains and the fjord. Time seemed to move more slowly there. Old wooden houses stood beside narrow streets, and the quiet atmosphere felt untouched by the modern world. He entered a tiny antique shop filled with handmade carvings, old maps and shelves, lined with forgotten memories. Behind the counter stood an elderly shopkeeper whose kind eyes seemed to recognize the determination written across the cowboy's face. The cowboy carefully placed the silver feather necklace on the wooden counter and asked if the old man had ever seen the young woman who wore it. The shopkeeper studied the pendant for a long moment before smiling gently. He nodded and explained that the girl had visited the shop only a few weeks earlier. She had bought supplies, thanked him for his kindness, and quietly said she was leaving the cabin behind. When he asked where she was going, she simply looked toward the distant mountains and smiled. "Some promises," she had said, "are easier to keep where they first begin." The cowboy looked through the shop window toward the snow-covered peaks rising above the valley. At that moment, everything finally made sense. She had not disappeared. She had returned to the very place where they had first promised to find each other again. Without wasting another second, he thanked the shopkeeper, slipped the silver feather safely into his pocket, and hurried toward the mountains, knowing that the next step could change both of their lives forever. The climb through the Norwegian mountains tested every ounce of the cowboy's strength. But nothing could stop a man who had traveled across an ocean to keep a promise. Every step brought him closer to the place where their story had begun. The quiet overlook above the fjord, where two strangers had once believed that love was stronger than distance. The last traces of winter rested on the mountain peaks, while the valley below slowly welcomed spring. As the sun disappeared behind the snowy horizon, the evening sky filled with countless stars, and the peaceful silence wrapped around him. He reached the cliff overlooking the crystal-clear fjord and stopped, searching every corner with hopeful eyes. For a brief moment, he thought he had come too late. His heart grew heavy and the silence felt endless. Then he heard the soft sound of footsteps behind him. He slowly turned around, and there she was. She stood only a few steps away, wearing the same gentle smile that had lived inside his heart every single day since they first met. Her eyes filled with tears, yet they shone with happiness instead of sadness. Neither of them spoke at first, because some moments are too beautiful for words. They simply looked at each other as if time itself had stopped. Finally, she smiled and softly whispered, "I knew you would come." The cowboy smiled through his tears and answered, "I promised, and I keep my promises." Without another word, they walked toward each other and embraced tightly. Months of loneliness, heartbreak, waiting, and hope disappeared in that single moment. It felt as though every difficult path, every painful goodbye, and every lonely night had led them back into each other's arms. They remained together, while the cold mountain breeze moved gently through the pine trees and the peaceful Norwegian landscape surrounded them like a silent blessing. After a long while, they slowly began walking back toward the old wooden cabin, their hands tightly held together as though they would never let go again. The lonely trail that once carried sadness now carried hope. She looked at him with a warm smile and quietly asked, "What happens now?" He looked ahead at the cabin waiting beside the fjord before answering, "Now we build a life together." She laughed softly, the same beautiful laugh he had missed every single day, and rested her head against his shoulder as they continued walking home. He had crossed an ocean. She had crossed a lifetime of waiting. Together they had crossed every fear that once separated them. Love had not needed perfect timing, easy roads, or endless luck. It had only needed two hearts that refused to forget. As they disappeared toward the cabin, the peaceful Norwegian night embraced them, and their journey became the beginning of a new life instead of the ending of an old one. Love never needed a map. It only needed a heart that always remembered the way back. Thank you for watching this Nordic love story. If this reunion touched your heart, don't forget to like this video,